Welcome and good evening. My name is Jacob Begard, and it's my great privilege to serve as Program Manager of the Common Ground Initiative in the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. On behalf of the Hauenstein Center, Gleaves Whitney and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and Brooke Clement in the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation or Presidential Museum and Library, thank you for joining us this evening. In typical fashion, we will begin with a leadership minute from a student in our Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy, followed by an introduction of this evening's fan favorite speaker by Gleaves Whitney. Following Bill's remarks, Gleaves will join him for the question and answer portion of the evening. As questions come to mind throughout the presentation, please use the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions. The leadership styles of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln will be discussed throughout this evening, and their lessons in life and leadership help shape and inform our students in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy to become the leaders of tomorrow, today. I'd like to now introduce one such student who exemplifies and transcends these lessons in leadership. Jania Thompson is a second-year student in the Leadership Academy and served as one of this year's lead fellows, helping develop curriculum and learning outcomes for her cohort. She will graduate next week with a bachelor's degree in political science and criminal justice. Please help me virtually welcome Jania.
Hello, thank you. My name is Jania Thompson, and I am a Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy Fellow and Lead Fellow. When I was first approached to conduct a leadership minute, I was shell-shocked. How do you summarize the necessity of leadership in just a minute and a half? Well, as graduation nears and I reflect on my academic journey, I'm confident that authentic leadership has shaped me into the leader and budding activist I am today. Through pivotal discussions, I have had the opportunity to grasp that real, powerful leaders are authentically themselves. They do not have to put on a facade of professionalism, nor do they have to completely change their leadership style to fit others' molds, which is something I've fallen victim to in majority white spaces. As an authentic leader, I am able to transcend past leadership positions and enter into any space with the confidence that my leadership abilities are more than just accomplishing minuscule tasks. As I transition into my professional career, I will rely on my natural strengths to create and foster diverse communities while offering support to those who need it. My name is Jania Thompson, and I am not only a strong leader, but an authentic leader. I would now like to hand over the microphone to Gleaves Whitney, the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation.
Thanks so much, Jania. You do us proud. We've watched you grow over the past several years, and it's just great to see you grow those wings and soar. Well, the University of Texas historian and Pulitzer Prize finalist, H.W. Brands, needs no introduction to our viewing audience. Bill has been coming to West Michigan for many years through the outstanding partnership of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, and of course, the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley. Bill has come back so many times, in fact, that he says West Michigan now feels like a second home. Well, we certainly concur. Maybe he'll be getting a Michigan cabin up here on one of our lakes, our beautiful lakes. Now, Bill has written some 30 books, and in the past few years, I've noticed that his biographies are looking more and more like the parallel lives of the great Greco-Roman historian Plutarch. Plutarch organized his histories around compelling ethical questions, and he looked at how eminent Greek and Roman leaders grappled with those questions. By juxtaposing the lives of two or more protagonists, Plutarch created a polarity in three parts. On the one hand, a moderate response to some pressing moral question or social issue. On the other hand, a more extreme response to that moral question. And of course, the tension between the two. And that's where history is made. That's where the narratives are written. In Bill's work, we have seen this method unfold in The Heirs of the Founders, in which he features Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, three polar figures there. And then in The General and the President, where he features MacArthur and Truman, and in the book under consideration tonight, The Zealot and the Emancipator, in which he features John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. In some ways, this latest book of Bill's, I think, must be the most difficult undertaking, because here he grapples with the story of how we Americans turned against ourselves. Bill starts by asking a philosophical question with huge practical implications. How does a good man challenge a great evil? It's a question that every generation must ask. It's a question that many of us who try to help students grow in their leadership must ponder together with the students. And let's turn now to Bill Brands to explore some of the ways of answering that perennial question. Bill, thank you for being with us.
Delighted to be back, Cleves. You know, I think it's going on nearly 20 years that we've been doing this. And I have to say, this is a part of my academic year I always look forward to with great eagerness, because I mean, I'm flattered to say I've developed great friends in Grand Rapids and in the area. And I've gotten to know Cleves and people who've worked with Cleves over the years. And I have to say that when people ask me sort of what's the model for a kind of research and educational center in a university setting, I always say the Hauenstein Center and Cleves Whitney's, you know, the guy at the person who founded it. Anyway, it's a great pleasure and honor to be speaking under these auspices again. And Cleves, you know, you mentioned that it struck you as that this is sort of like Plutarch's parallel lives. And I say, in all honesty, that I was not thinking of that as I was doing it. And actually, I wasn't thinking of that as I was doing the book on MacArthur and Truman or Clay and Webster and Calhoun, although I probably should have been thinking that, because I must have encountered Plutarch in high school. I went to a good Jesuit high school, and they were very much into classical kind of stuff like that. But I suppose I put it in the back of my mind, except that I'll say that my thinking on this maybe evolved in a parallel way to what Plutarch did. And that is that, well, after having written a number of biographies, that is some books about a single individual, I came to appreciate the strengths, but also the weaknesses of that view. And the strength is you get to know one person really well. The weakness, though, is that your subject tends to be, or at least tends to appear to be, the center of the universe. And no individual, however important that individual might be, is the center of the universe. And also, I wanted to give sort of equal time to other sides of debates. And so I kind of fell into this. Well, Truman and MacArthur were the first in this. And then I did the three legislators from the 19th century, Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. And when I wanted to look at the question of slavery and the evolution of attitudes towards slavery, and not just attitudes, but the evolution of policies towards slavery, I didn't really think of, at least at first, I didn't think of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln as opposites, because in fact, they agreed on the central issue of their era, that slavery was wrong. But they disagreed on what to do about it. And that's where the philosophical becomes practical. Because the question as I posed in the book, and it is very akin to what Glee said, is it's one thing to conclude that something is wrong, but the real question for a citizen, especially in a democracy, is what are you going to do about it? And I teach undergraduates at the University of Texas. I make a point of teaching a required class that is basically, it's there because we don't teach civics per se anymore, but the idea is to prepare citizens for participation in this democratic life. And so students have to deal with the question of, if you see something wrong, it could be something that is just downright evil, or it could be something as innocuous as a policy you think is misguided. As a citizen of democracy, as a voter in democracy, you have some responsibility. And what's the nature of that responsibility? And how do you decide what to do? So anyway, I have been posing this question to my students, the question, in fact, as it relates specifically to John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. I've been posing this question to them for some years. And very often this is the way I come upon book subjects, because I try ideas out on my students. I find this is the best preparation for writing, because I have to talk my students through it. I have to talk myself through it. And I see what their reaction is. My students stand in for the general readership that most of my books are aimed for these days. And so the question comes down to, in the case of John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, these are two men who agree that slavery is wrong. But the thing they disagree on is, what are you going to do about it? And that, again, is sort of the pointed question. What's the question of civic responsibility? What does the citizen, what does the good person do in the face of evil? But this is also a story, and I'll say this, that it partakes of the approach that I have applied to writing in biographies, in that my biographies have always been lives and times. I'm a historian. Some biographers are journalists, some occasionally are novelists, but those of us biographers who are historians, we're interested in the individuals as individuals, but we're also interested in the individuals as representatives or participants in the life of their times. And so with John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, I get to look at, I have to look at the evolution of attitudes toward slavery, especially during the first half of the 19th century. John Brown was born in 1800, Abraham Lincoln in 1809, and they both lived, John Brown to 1859, Abraham Lincoln to 1865. So their lives span basically almost 2/3 of a century in each case, and it covers the most sort of formative and transformative period in American history regarding the institution of slavery. So to extend the chronology a bit farther, if we could take a snapshot of American attitudes towards slavery in 1750, so 50 years before these two are born. In 1750, almost no one in the United States, in the American colonies, almost no one in the British Empire looked on slavery as wrong. They might say that it was inconvenient, they might say that it was unsavory, but almost nobody looked on slavery as a moral wrong. I say almost no one. There were some Quakers, there were a few Baptists who, for religious reasons, but in terms of policy, in terms of attitudes toward public affairs, no, slavery was just a sort of unfortunate aspect of life. It's kind of like death and taxes and war and all that other bad stuff that happens. People get sick and die. It's a personal tragedy. And nobody who wasn't a slave wanted to be a slave. But again, there are many things in life, even in our lives today, that we just sort of accept because we kind of can't figure out any way around it. And until we can, until you see an alternative, it doesn't do you a lot of good to say, oh, that's morally wrong. So anyway, that was the attitude of, I would say 95% or more. And I'll have to make a separate category here for non-enslaved people in the American colonies, although it's worth noting that there were instances of slaves who became free and then purchased slaves for themselves. So they objected to themselves being slaves. I say they didn't want it, but they didn't object to the institution per se. That's in 1750. By 1800, attitudes are beginning to change. And so the idea of slavery as wrong is beginning to take hold, but only in part of the country. And a lot of this reflects the fact that halfway between 1750 and 1800, the United States became a republic. It had been part of an empire. There was a British crown and all this, but now this is a republic. And a republic is based on, well, as Thomas Jefferson put it, that all men are created equal. But slavery is an institution that is absolutely egregiously unequal. So how do you square the idea of the equality on which a republic depends and the inequality that is at the basis of slavery? So this is something that's beginning to create cognitive dissonance in Americans. Still, for very many in the United States, slavery falls in the category of necessary evils. It's not something we're proud of. It's kind of like war today. You know, almost nobody likes war, but very few people are willing to give up war as a matter of principle. Sometimes you have to do it. So American slaveholders, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Henry Clay, of a later generation, they all looked on slavery as a bad thing. And they wished their country could figure out a way out from under slavery. But because it seemed necessary to run the Southern economy, then they couldn't figure out how to get rid of the evil part of it. And in a lot of life, there is this balancing of necessity and virtue. And if it's a necessary evil, if it's a really necessary evil, then you're willing to sort of put up with the evil part. But what happened between 1776, say, and 1800, and continuing a little bit farther down into the 19th century, slavery became less necessary in the northern states. Their economies evolved in a way that allowed them to give up slavery at relatively minimal cost. In the first place, there had never been very many enslaved people in the northern states. And so for Massachusetts, for example, to give up slavery was no particularly big deal. But it did create, for the first time, a moral rift in the country on this question of slavery, because when Northerners could take the position, could observe that slavery was no longer necessary to the operation of their economies, then they could highlight the fact that it was evil. So if necessity and virtue, or good and evil, are balanced at first, and something becomes less necessary, then the evil stands out. And that was the beginning of an abolitionist political movement in the United States. And it was based entirely in the North, in part because Northerners now had the luxury of considering slavery to be a moral institution and a moral blight on the Republic. Whereas in the South, it seemed to be as necessary. In fact, in some ways, it was more necessary than ever. George Washington thought that slavery was coming to an economic end because tobacco had worn out the soil in Virginia. He was already getting out of the cultivation of tobacco and planting wheat like northern farmers. And if wheat is your principal crop, you don't want slaves. Even if you don't, it's not that you just don't need slaves, you don't want slaves because it's labor intensive just for short periods of time. But for something like tobacco or something like cotton, then you need to have labor all year round. And so the inflexibility of slavery is not a particular problem. In fact, it's kind of a virtue. But for northern farmers, and as the northern manufacturing system is coming in, you need a flexible workforce, and slavery is, if anything, as inflexible as can be. So it's important to keep in mind that northern states ended slavery within their boundaries, not out of any fit of morality. It's just that they no longer needed slavery, so they could emphasize that evil part. But when they did, and you can appreciate this, that when they started talking about slavery as this moral wrong, of course, people who still felt somehow, well, that slavery was a necessity, they felt that they were being lectured to. They thought they were being preached to, and as indeed they were. It's a little bit like, I don't know if any in the audience are vegetarians, but some people, by no means all vegetarians, but some people start out as vegetarians for one reason or another, and then they conceive that, oh, well, this is better for the planet, or this is, it's a nod toward animal rights or something. And so it requires moral overtones. Well, that was what happened regarding attitudes towards slavery. Now, I'm speaking of attitudes sort of wholesale. I want to focus in on two individuals, John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, because each of them were born into a family that was just sort of mildly disposed against slavery, but not on any particular principle and not in any particularly acute form. And I'll say that, well, Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky, a slave state, but there were plenty of people in Kentucky who didn't think slavery was a very good institution. Henry Clay, who became Abraham Lincoln's model of the statesman. He was, as I said, he was opposed to slavery his whole life, despite the fact that he was a slave owner. And this seems like quite a paradox to our view these days. But somebody like Henry Clay, like Thomas Jefferson before him, took the position that if you're going to end slavery, you have to get the support of the slave owners. And you're going to get the support of the slave owners more readily if you are one of them. If you emancipate your slaves, then you're simply another Quaker. You're just another one of those raving abolitionists. So anyway, so Lincoln's family was opposed to slavery for the same reason that many northern whites and some actually southern whites were opposed to slavery, in that it diminished the value, it demeaned the worth of manual labor, because manual workers who weren't slaves found themselves competing against slaves in the marketplace, and it was really hard to compete against slaves in terms of your wages and anything else. And it just demeaned manual labor. So Abraham Lincoln's father took the family out of Kentucky to Indiana, really, and it was in this sort of opposition to slavery. Now, it's important to note in the context of the evolution of these attitudes that just because you were against slavery did not mean that you were more favorably disposed toward Black people than, in some cases, people who were in favor of slavery. It was as much out of your own self-interest as it was out of any sympathy toward enslaved peoples. And it certainly didn't mean in those days that you were in favor of equal rights, equal treatment, equality, social equality for Black people. You could be very racist and still be opposed to slavery. So this is what complicates all this. John Brown, born 9 years before Abraham Lincoln in 1800, was born in Connecticut, but his family moved to Ohio. Connecticut was a free state, although it had had a fairly large number of slaves before emancipation there, because Connecticut actually had a very active tobacco industry. But the family moved from Connecticut to Ohio, which had been a free state from the beginning. And John Brown grew up in free states. He really didn't know slavery in any direct way, but he had an epiphany when he was a boy. He was 8 or 10 years old. He remembered this in middle age. And he talked about a particular time when he was playing in in Ohio. Now, I should point out, Ohio was a free state, but free states in those days often saw slaves coming through because they would come with their masters and they would be valets, or in some cases, if somebody had a herd of cattle in Kentucky and wanted to drive it to Columbus, Ohio, then his enslaved black drovers, herders would go with him, and they were still slaves in Ohio. And that was just kind of the way it worked. It was the boundary between North and South, between slave and free, was pretty flexible and permeable. Anyway, so John Brown remembered this day when he was playing. He was, as a boy, he was playing, and he was playing with this other boy who happened to be black and happened to be, as it turned out, a slave. And so John Brown is playing, and they're playing along. This and the other kid are playing, and they're having a fine time until all of a sudden, this white man, this adult man, comes up and starts yelling at the black boy, and then starts beating him over the head and shoulders. And John Brown is kind of amazed at this, and he doesn't quite know what to make of it. But he said, it took me a while to realize what was going on here. It took me a while to realize the fundamental difference between my position. No one would ever do this to me, except perhaps my father, and that would be a family thing. But someone was allowed to do it to this black boy. And this was the difference, John Brown said. And John Brown remembered that as a boy, he felt sort of this feeling of something's wrong here, and I need to do something about it. But he's only 9 years old. So what's he going to do about it? Well, what he did was he stored it away. And as I say, his family lived in Ohio. Now, there's something about John Brown that is not unlike very many people who find their calling almost by process of elimination. John Brown tried his hand at any number of things. He tried his hand at farming and herding cattle and herding sheep and various kinds of business, and he just could not get a grip anywhere. So for the first 40 years of his life nearly, he's trying to figure out, what can I do with my life? How can I make a mark? I just described his first epiphany. His second epiphany came in 1837. John Brown at this point is living in Hudson, Ohio. Hudson had become something of a hotbed of abolitionism. Now, I have to digress here for a moment. Abolitionism as a political movement really took hold starting in the 1830s. By this time, pretty much all the enslaved peoples are now either dead or free in the northern states. So slavery is this exclusively Southern thing. And furthermore, in part because slavery is becoming more entrenched, in part because it appears that the country is going to have to make a decision, and not least because around 1830, this is the time when America really becomes a democracy, a republic in which political power actually rests with the people, not just sort of vaguely rests upon the people, but ordinary people actually exercise political power. It was ordinary people that elected Andrew Jackson president in 1828. And it's important to keep all this in mind regarding attitudes towards slavery, regarding the sectional dispute, regarding the Civil War. Anyway, so John Brown is living in Hudson, Ohio, which has become something of a hotbed of abolitionism. And it's at this point in 1837 when news comes to Hudson, Ohio from Illinois that an abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy, has been murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Altoona, Illinois, on the Mississippi River. And for John Brown and other abolitionists, this demonstrated that what they like to call the slave power, this was a reference to the Southern states and the outsized political influence they had in American politics. The slave power was going too far because not only had a man been killed for his opinions, but he had been killed in a free state on free soil. The slave aggressors, the slave power had gone too far. So John Brown, on this day in 1837, stands up in his church in Hudson, Ohio, and says, here, before the eyes of God, before the congregation, I pledge my life to the battle against slavery. John Brown has found his calling, but he still doesn't quite know what the battle against slavery is going to consist of. Hold that thought for John Brown, because we have to deal with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809. As I say, he spent his first few years in Kentucky around slaves. Then he moved to Indiana, and his teen years were in Indiana. And his epiphany occurred when he was about 18 years old. And he was hired by a merchant in Indiana to float a cargo to be sold at New Orleans, to float it down the Ohio River, down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And guiding a flatboat is no big deal. Huck Finn could do it, so Abraham Lincoln could do it. And so off he goes. And he arrives at great adventure, and he arrives in New Orleans. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, was aware of slavery. As I say, he had seen slaves when he was a kid in Kentucky. He saw more slaves in Indiana, but he had never witnessed a slave auction on the order of what he saw in New Orleans. New Orleans was a hub of the slave economy. And Abraham Lincoln recalled in later years that seeing human beings put up on the block, examined, sold like horses and cattle and pigs, caused him to realize how wrong slavery was. Now, this is important because both John Brown and Abraham Lincoln had this notion, a vague notion that slavery was wrong, but now each one has had this personal moment. Slavery is really wrong. Okay, so this is how they arrive at the common conclusion that slavery was wrong. But the question that I posed, the question that Gleaves articulated, that I posed at the beginning of my book is, so what are you going to do about it, John Brown? What are you going to do about it, Abraham Lincoln? It's one thing to say it's wrong, but what are you going to do? And strikingly, John Brown and Abraham Lincoln both were fully aware of the abolitionists. The abolitionists were editors. William Lloyd Garrison started the Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper in 1831 in Boston. And they were speakers. Wendell Phillips was one of the great speakers of the United States. So they wrote and they spoke against slavery, but does that actually free any slaves? Does that actually get anything done? Does that actually weaken the slave power, the slave institution? John Brown concluded that it did not. And John Brown decided that he needed to actually take part. So he moved his family from Ohio to upstate New York, to a place called North Elba, where there was a colony of free Black men and women. And it was a demonstration colony funded by a philanthropist, an abolitionist, who wanted to demonstrate that the assertions that Black people were somehow inferior or less productive than white people was, to the extent that it was true at all, was simply a reflection of the lack of opportunity they'd had. And so they were given farms to farm, and they're going to demonstrate that they can be just as productive, they can be just as good citizens as anybody else. And John Brown decides to move his family there and take part in this experiment. He also begins to dabble in the Underground Railroad, and he starts thinking about, reading about, talking about doing more. But his moment comes, the moment when the battle that he has declared, the war he has declared against slavery in 1837, actually gives him an opportunity to take action. And that comes in 1854. 1854 is the year in which the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. And a Kansas-Nebraska Act, it sounds fairly innocuous. What it did was to provide territorial governments for Kansas and Nebraska. These are two territories that are being carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. The reason the act was important was that these were two territories that were carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, the part of the Louisiana Purchase that had been reserved to freedom by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed, overturned that aspect of the Missouri Compromise. And this falls in the category of, in constitutional history, in law, there's this concept of settled law. So we know what the law is, we know what to expect. And the settled law of the Missouri Compromise had been settled for 34 years. And then it was overturned. It was overturned in this case by an act of Congress, which just repealed that part of it and opened Kansas territory and Nebraska territory to immigration. Now, it had been open before, but once you have a territorial government, it's much more attractive. You can get land titles, you can do all this other stuff. But what it did also was to prompt a competition between Southerners and Northerners, immigrants to Kansas, because Kansas territory was open to settlement on the basis of what was called popular sovereignty. That is, slaveholders can bring their slaves, free Northerners can bring their horses and mules. And when enough people, 60,000 people have arrived in Kansas territory to justify statehood, they will get together and they will vote on a constitution. And the constitution will make Kansas state a free state or a slave state. So there's this competition. Who can put more settlers on the ground? And John Brown goes to Kansas. He wants to be part of this movement. He wants to be part of the competition. And this is where John Brown decides how he is going to wage war against slavery. In fact, he decides that he is going to adopt methods that are violent. They are mortally violent. And following some back and forth between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery settlers, John Brown has become outraged by the inability, by the failure of the anti-slavery side to defend itself. So he gathers 5 followers aside here. John Brown had a strange magnetism. I still haven't been able to explain it entirely, but people followed John Brown because, in part because he had sincere convictions. He had the courage of his convictions. He was a brave man. There's no question about that. He seemed, there's something more than that. John Brown was, I don't want to no, I'm not going to say, I am not going to say that John Brown had the same hold over his followers that Charles Manson did. I'm not going to say that. However, John Brown did inspire people to do things that they wouldn't do, wrong things that they wouldn't have done otherwise. John Brown gathered this small group of followers, and basically he didn't lift the sword against anybody, but his band, on John Brown's orders, dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their beds, men, in the middle of the night and hacked them to death with broadswords. It's a textbook definition, basically, of terrorism. John Brown committed lethal violence to send a political message. These 5 men were no threat to John Brown, but John Brown was basically saying, any of you other pro-slavery settlers thinking of coming to Kansas, this could happen to you. So John Brown becomes notorious. He goes on the run. He's wanted for murder in Kansas territory, but because this is in a day before photographs, there were no photographs of John Brown on the post office walls in the States. He could go from state to state. He could cut his hair, grow his beard, cut his beard, change his name. He was actually a master of disguise, which is actually quite striking because John Brown impressed people with his sincerity, but his sincerity was often faked. So he was really good at faking. But anyway, so John Brown has bigger plans after this. He circulates among abolitionists and he decides that he's going to carry the war against slavery. As he puts it, he's going to take the war to Africa, by which he meant the slave South. Kansas was just this border territory. He was going to take it to Virginia. And he plans this raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, where a federal arsenal was located. And the point of attacking the arsenal was to seize the weapons of the arsenal and distribute them among slaves, among young enslaved men in the vicinity of Harper's Ferry. They would use these weapons to rise up in armed insurrection for their freedom and to shake the institution of slavery, to shake it to its foundations, and the whole system would collapse. This was John Brown's plan. Well, the plan didn't quite pan out. But I'll stop there with John Brown because John Brown demonstrated by this the lengths to which he would go in his opposition to slavery. John Brown concluded essentially that there was no limit on what you could justifiably do in opposition to slavery. You could engage in cold-blooded murder, as John Brown did. You could try to foment an armed insurrection, which, if it actually caught on, would certainly lead to the deaths of thousands of people. But John Brown believed that slavery was so wrong that it justified those kinds of measures. Abraham Lincoln, meanwhile, yields nothing to John Brown in terms of his conviction that slavery was wrong. But he thought John Brown was quite wrong in the measures that he undertook. Lincoln believed that freedom would come, emancipation would come only by constitutional means. Lincoln was a lawyer. He was a man who believed in the rule of law. He was a politician. He believed in government. He believed that actions like those of John Brown were wrong-headed and counterproductive. They were counterproductive in the short term because John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry did cause Southern slaveholders to tighten the shackles even more on the slaves and to eliminate even those minor freedoms that slaves enjoyed, getting Sundays off or where they could visit family members on another plantation or something like that. So in the short term, it made the lives of the people that John Brown professed to sympathize with even worse. But In the longer term, it made it more difficult, if not impossible, to emancipate slaves under the Constitution. In fact, it threatened the existence of the Constitution. It threatened the stability of the Union. And indeed, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, to summarize things, he launches the raid, but it fails. He's arrested. Several people are killed. He's tried for treason against Virginia and for murder in the deaths of several people in the raid on Harper's Ferry. He is convicted and he is executed. And the reaction to the John Brown raid is strikingly different north and south. Southerners, especially Southern slaveholders, look on John Brown as a terrorist, somebody who wants to see them murdered in their beds. And they take the attitude that if the North allows people like this, if the North creates people like this, then there is no safety for our institution or for ourselves and our children remaining in the Union. And what made things worse was the reaction of many Northerners, especially Northern abolitionists, to the execution of John Brown. Instead of apologizing for John Brown for committing this act of terrorism, in fact, Northerners, especially the Northern abolitionists, praised John Brown. They treated him as a martyr. Now, the closest thing I can imagine this is in the terrorist attacks on 9/11 in the United States. If a substantial group of people in the United States said, yay for Al-Qaeda, yay for the martyred terrorists, you could imagine this would not sit well with other people in the United States. Well, that caused Southerners to feel that they were even more threatened than before. So the Civil War came. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was not the trigger for the Civil War, but it was one thing after another that caused Southerners, slaveholding Southerners, but not just slaveholding Southerners, white Southerners, to conclude that they were no longer safe in the Union. Oh, another contributor to this was the election of Abraham Lincoln as president of the United States. So when I was writing this book, I had to deal with, I've got these parallel lives going, but my two figures never meet. And so, what are you going to do about that? It really would be best from dramatic purposes if they met kind of at the climax of their careers or something, and they spoke to each other and all this. Well, they didn't speak to each other, but Abraham Lincoln did speak about John Brown after he heard about the murders in Kansas and then the raid on Harper's Ferry. And Lincoln went out of his way to say that John Brown is not a Republican. Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party was brand new, and one of its pillars, one of its principles was opposition to slavery, opposition to expansion of slavery in the territories. And the Republicans said, we are not abolitionists. We don't believe that slavery is so wrong that that we're going to throw away the Constitution. Some of the abolitionists did. William Lloyd Garrison publicly burned a copy of the Constitution on the 4th of July to say, I want nothing to do with a Constitution that protects slavery. In fact, some Northern abolitionists concluded that the North should secede from the South. This was in the 1850s. So they would feel no longer any moral responsibility for basically involvement in slavery. They just sort of washed their hands. They didn't explain how this would do any good for the slaves, but nonetheless, they no longer had to feel guilty about it. Anyhow, Abraham Lincoln gets elected president. Oh, excuse me. First he says, I'm not John Brown. John Brown is not a Republican. I don't believe this. I don't believe in what John Brown was doing. Lincoln, by this time, had the inside track to the Republican nomination for 1860, and he was almost desperate to demonstrate that he's not one of those guys, because he knew the arithmetic of the Electoral College by this time indicated that any reasonably moderate person that the Republicans could nominate would be the next president of the United States. And Lincoln wanted to demonstrate, I'm that moderate guy. I am not John Brown. You don't have to be scared for the Union if I'm elected. Well, he was elected. And at first, 7 Southern states took this as their excuse to say, okay, we're leaving the Union. South Carolina had been itching to do this for decades. Other states, they'd been talking about it for a while. And so they claimed to believe that slavery was not secure because of the election of Abraham Lincoln. This despite the fact that Lincoln said over and over again, I have no authority as president of the United States. The Congress has no authority to legislate on slavery in the states. It's up to the states. But on top of the John Brown raid, then an operational majority in 7 Southern states at first said, okay, we're out of here. And Lincoln has to decide what to do about that. Anyway, so I'm not going to trace the history of the rest of the Civil War. I'm going to stop here, and Gleaves and I are going to have a conversation along with anybody else who has questions to ask. And it looks like we've got some, Gleaves.
That's right. We do have some questions. Bill, all the times that you've come to us, we've seen you with such energy as you pace the stage and, you know, you're using your hands. And I don't think there was much loss of energy over Zoom. I think you're one of the few people we've hosted all year. That energy is coming right through. So thank you for bringing that.
I got to tell you something. I got to have to tell you, please, that in this year since we've been doing stuff on Zoom, I've actually tried it where I'm standing up and not sitting down. But the trouble was I kept walking out of the camera range. So I had, at least I'm sitting down.
Right. Oh, that's good. So you have a seatbelt strapping you in right now.
I do. Yeah.
Well, here's a very interesting hypothetical. Without John Brown, would we know and have the Abraham Lincoln we do today?
So that's a really good question. If Abraham Lincoln could answer that question, he would say, yes, that yes, I would have been president, but maybe I wouldn't have had to deal with the Civil War. Now, I said earlier on that Abraham Lincoln's belief was that slavery would end in the United States by constitutional means. And this could have come in two forms. One is that the Southern states would have decided one by one that slavery no longer suited them. And this would have come about as a result of the modernizing process, the same modernizing process that had always swept across the North. Or this is more of an outlier considering the difficulty of amending the Constitution, or the Constitution could simply be amended. And if you could get 3/4 of the states behind it, then the Constitution would be amended and we would get a 13th Amendment ending slavery. But Abraham Lincoln's belief was that slavery would end in the United States without a civil war. And furthermore, he believed that the Civil War was going to make ending slavery more difficult. It's really important to remember that Abraham Lincoln did not lead the country to war against the seceded states for the purpose of ending slavery. In fact, he went out of his way to say that this is not a war about slavery. This is a war about the Union, or to put it in terms that are often debated, the old chestnut was the Civil War about states' rights or was it about slavery? For the first year and a half of the war, for Lincoln, it was all about states' rights. More precisely, his disagreement with the seceded states, that their states' rights included the right to secede. And so, in fact, I mentioned initially there were 7 states that decided to secede or try to secede. They claimed that they had seceded. They joined they created the Confederacy. Now, it's important to bear in mind that those were 7 states. There were 8 slave states that remained in the Union, and Lincoln had to keep this in mind. And so the shooting began at Fort Sumter in Charleston in April 1861. And as soon as the shooting began, then Lincoln issued a call for volunteers. And when he said he wanted 75,000 volunteers, and he wanted volunteers to save the Union, he got 150,000 in answer to his call for 75,000. Lincoln knew very well that if he had issued a call for volunteers to free the slaves, he wouldn't have gotten 150,000. He wouldn't have gotten 75,000. He might have gotten 5,000. So there was not a groundswell of support in the Union. And I was about to say in the North, but remember that at the time of Fort Sumter, half of the South had still not seceded yet. Half of the South was still part of the Union. And Lincoln had to keep this in mind. But when he issued this call for volunteers, then Virginia in particular, which was the bellwether state, Virginia realized that there's going to be this war. There's going to be a war between the federal government and these states. And Virginians, and Robert E. Lee, see, I still do move my hands around a lot. Robert E. Lee is a good example of this. Lee was opposed to the idea of secession. He thought secession was a bad idea. But when Virginia seceded, he said, okay, I have to go along with my home state. But for Virginia, it was about slavery, but it wasn't only about slavery. It was also about the fact that Virginians believed that they didn't want a federal army marching through Virginia, because if you're going to get to South Carolina to fight, you're going to have to march through Virginia. And they didn't want a federal army marching through Virginia. So this is when things get a little bit more complicated, but there's still, after 4 more states go out, that makes 11 states, 11 slave states. There's still four key states, well, 3 plus Delaware, which would eventually give us a president. But at the time, it was pretty small. But Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, these were absolutely key to any military strategy for holding the Union together. And so Lincoln, even if he had thought he had the constitutional authority, which he didn't, even if he thought he had constitutional authority, he thought it would have been strategically suicidal to declare war against slavery, because it certainly would have driven Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri into the arms of the Confederacy. If Maryland had joined the Confederacy, then the federal government would have had to evacuate Washington because Washington would have been pinned between two Confederate states. And it would have been terribly much more difficult to hold the Union together with the loss of those states. So from a strategic purpose, Lincoln believed that I can't declare war on slavery. However, abolitionists thought, oh boy, here's our chance. No, actually, I shouldn't say that. Some of the abolitionists, at least at first, Horace Greeley was a good example. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, was an abolitionist. But when Southern states started seceding, his initial reaction was, let them go. As I said, there was this history of abolitionists wishing the North would leave. He gradually changed his mind when it became clear that Lincoln was going to fight. But some of the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass is an important third character in my book. John Brown and Abraham Lincoln never met in person, but Frederick Douglass knew both of them. And Frederick Douglass had strong opinions on both of them. Frederick Douglass greatly admired John Brown's passion and conviction. He thought John Brown had a very poor sense of reality and what would actually work. He thought that Abraham Lincoln had a really good sense of what would work, but he thought he was slow to recognize the centrality of slavery in this dispute between the sections. Now, in Lincoln's defense, it's one thing for Frederick Douglass to say this, but Frederick Douglass actually didn't have any responsibility for holding the Union together. And plenty of abolitionists, as I cited William Lloyd Garrison, had no reverence for the Union or for the Constitution. They wanted to end slavery. But Lincoln's thinking on this was, and I'm going to get back to something I said earlier, that this is an age when American democracy is first taking hold. And American democracy was rare to the point of being unique in the world at the time. Democracy hadn't caught on, and most people thought it never would. And so Lincoln grew up wondering, is this country a democracy? And when it became a democracy during the 1830s, 1840s, by no means a perfect democracy. We're still not a perfect democracy. Women couldn't vote, Black people couldn't vote, but still, adult white men could vote, which was a big expansion of the franchise. But Lincoln had to deal with the fact that this was still an experiment in self-government. We live in the year 2021, and we know that, okay, the American democracy survived all these trials. And there's this tendency to think, well, it was inevitable that it would. No, it's not inevitable, and certainly wasn't inevitable for Lincoln. This is why Lincoln took such pains to say most articulately, most eloquently in his Gettysburg Address, that this was a war about whether government of the people, by the people, for the people, that is democracy, self-government, could exist or would perish from the earth. So this is what was at stake. And Lincoln believed that it was the Constitution that was the guarantor of such freedoms as any Americans exercised. And at the moment, it was mostly white Americans and more males than females. But Lincoln saw that freedom was this progressive expansion, and Lincoln fully expected that it would encompass Black people and that there would be no more slavery. But it had to take place under the auspices of the Union. There was something else. Lincoln finally concluded that the war effort required emancipation as a war measure. So he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. However, Lincoln, good lawyer that he was, realized that the Emancipation Proclamation was a weak reed on which to rest the end of slavery. It basically, the thinking behind, the philosophy behind the Emancipation Proclamation was, and I should mention that the term of art, the term of war for freed slaves were contrabands. So these are like contraband goods that are, you try to blockade against them and so on. But the general practice during war, and American Union generals did this, if you march into Virginia, Grant marches into Virginia, or Sherman marches into Georgia, then it's accepted practice that you can commandeer a farmhouse or a home, and this can be your headquarters. Or if you need horses or mules to haul your wagons, you can seize the property of the belligerents on the other side. This was just a standard practice of war. However, it was understood that when the war ends, you give up that house, you hand back the horses and the mules, so you can use the property of enemies for the purposes of the war. But at the end of the war, you don't get to keep the property, you have to give it back. And so Lincoln understood that if the war ends and the Emancipation Proclamation is the only thing that gives slaves their freedom, which, by the way, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to those states and parts of states that were in rebellion against the Union. It didn't apply to Maryland. It didn't apply to Kentucky. It didn't apply to Missouri. It didn't apply to, in fact, it didn't apply to parts of New Orleans, which had already been pacified by the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln, as a lawyer, could realize, hey, there are going to be lawyers coming out of the woodwork on behalf of the slave owners and say, okay, the war is over. You used my property during the war, give me my property back. And Lincoln wouldn't have much of a defense against that. So in the next breath, after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln said, and we have to pass the 13th Amendment. And it's really important to remember that slavery in the United States did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery in the United States did not even end with the end of the war. Slavery in the United States did not end with Juneteenth, which is when the Proclamation of Emancipation was announced in 1865, June 19th, 1865, in Texas, in Galveston, Texas. Texas, the state, was sort of the last to know. No, in fact, slavery did not end until the 13th Amendment was ratified. There were slaves in Kentucky, there were slaves in Maryland, there were slaves in other states, there's slaves in the District of Columbia, slaves not in the district, but there were slaves still in the United States until the Constitution Amendment was amended. So Lincoln actually was right. Slavery didn't end until the Constitution said it's done, it's over. And so this is, John Brown tried to start this war that would free the slaves. In his lifetime, he failed to start the war, and he failed to free any slaves except for a dozen that he actually led by the Underground Railroad route. Abraham Lincoln tried to prevent a war and failed, and he tried to keep the war, at least at first, from being about slavery. But Lincoln's double failure wound up with the two fundamental questions left over unanswered from the Constitutional Convention way back in 1787. The two questions that had vexed American national politics from then. The first question was, how far can the states go in asserting their rights? Can they secede from the Union? Lincoln's victory, the victory of the Union during the Civil War, said, no, you can't. And in fact, there has been, ever since, there has been no serious effort by any state to try to secede from the Union. Whereas before 1860 and 1861, states were talking about it all the time. So it answered that question, but it answered that question not by force of argument, but by force of arms. The second question is, what are we going to do about slavery in a republic? And Lincoln was able to answer it. And it's, well, shoot, I mean, even people who write books called the Zealot and the Emancipator contribute to this idea that, oh, it's the Emancipation Proclamation that did it. Now, I will be the first to admit that the Emancipation Proclamation made an end to slavery part of the war aims of the Union. So after that point, it was unthinkable that the war would end with slavery intact. But still, it had to be written into the Constitution. And so slavery didn't end until the end of 1865, when the Constitution, the 13th Amendment, was finally ratified.
Bill, thank you for, I think, encapsulating what would be fascinating for a lot of high school teachers. You know, you're an old high school teacher, and I think the way you just summarized when slavery actually ended was so apt. And that's the kind of lesson you want our students who are preparing for their role as citizens and as leaders to know. Another question that we have here that's really interesting is the idea that you have been teaching this material for 4 decades. You know this material frontwards and backwards. So what did you learn that surprised you in the course of reading, going back to the source documents and constructing the narrative where you juxtapose John Brown and Abraham Lincoln? What struck you as something you hadn't really concentrated on before? Great question.
Yeah, I do. I have to think about this question because you refer to my teaching. Yeah. So I have an advantage over a lot of people who write history, American history in my case, in that I teach. In fact, sometimes people ask me, so how do you write your books while you're still teaching? And I basically say that I couldn't write my books without the teaching, because I've been preparing to write this book for 35 years or so. I mean, I knew about John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, so I just hadn't decided I was going to write that particular book. So I have really thought through all of these questions, all these issues. So it is indeed the fact that I wasn't struck by anything in particular. So there wasn't a aha, boy, that's it. No, in some ways, I'm as puzzled as when I began regarding, for example, the magnetism, the charisma of John Brown. It's one thing for a leader, a charismatic leader, to motivate his or her followers to do good, to do things that they are proud of. But there are those, I'm not necessarily going to call them a darker leader, but someone who can motivate his followers to transgress the moral boundaries that they would usually observe. The people who joined John Brown in Kansas did not think of themselves as murderers. But John Brown inspired them, caused them to commit murder. So what was going on here? He was somebody who was absolutely convinced of the rectitude of his actions. But people who believe that are a dime a dozen. And again, I'll use the example of terrorists. You know, most terrorists are really sincere people, at least the ones who are willing to accept death themselves. You could put terrorists in another category who send other people off to die. But the ones who are willing to die themselves, they sincerely believe in the rectitude of what they're doing. And in fact, maybe I've sounded harsh on John Brown, because I'll say this, that my students, many of them find John Brown a more engaging character than Abraham Lincoln. Because if you jump forward to the year 2020, the year 2021, John Brown in his attitudes toward race, for example, is much closer to a modern sensibility, especially a liberal kind of ideal, than Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, in fact, my students very often express a kind of distress when they discovered that Lincoln urged free Black people in the United States to leave the United States and go to Liberia or go to someplace in Central America, because Lincoln said, we just, the two races can't live together. And Lincoln certainly did not seem to be in favor of full social equality. He said on a number of occasions when he was debating Stephen Douglas, he said, and Douglas would say, as the Democrats said, the opponents of the Republicans would say, you're a social leveler. You believe in making Black people equal to white people. You want to see marriage between Black people and white people. And Lincoln's response was, just because I do not want to enslave a Black woman does not mean I want to marry her. And so this kind of thing makes my students, 18-year-olds today, oh God, I don't know if I should admire Abraham Lincoln or not. Whereas John Brown is so absolutely certain, and he puts his life on the line. And so John Brown is that kind of character, but it's John Brown. Well, so if I were to have John Brown here, I'd say, Mr. Brown, please explain yourself, defend yourself, because I've said things that make you look not like this upstanding character, perhaps. And what John Brown would have said is that he was engaged in a war, that slavery began long ago. And so in war, there are casualties. John Brown, to the extent that he even admitted that he was responsible for those deaths by murder in Kansas, said those are casualties of war. Now, and in trying to instigate the slave uprising at Harper's Ferry, he would just say, okay, the war has begun. There's been this violence committed against Black people in this nation, in the South, for decades. And finally, we're just fighting back. So John Brown wound up on the right side of history. And if there's any complaint against John Brown, if you believe that history has this direction, the complaint is he just got there a little bit too soon. And that's, if you know how things turned out, then you have a hard time holding that much against John Brown. But there's another issue. To the extent that one wants to pass judgment on historical individuals, and I make a point of not trying to pass judgment on historical individuals. I think it's presumptuous of anybody to pass judgment on anybody else. Nobody knows what's going through other people's minds. It's between those individuals and their God or their conscience or something. But it's something that does come up all the time. And so under what circumstances would somebody, would I, for example, be willing to agree with John Brown and his interpretation of history that the war had already begun? Well, John Brown, on his way to the gallows, smuggled a note to his jailer. He had won over his jailer the way he won over everybody else, the judge in the courtroom, the jury almost. He won over the governor of Virginia, who defended John Brown's sincerity to other people, even as John Brown was lying to him. It's, I can't remember which of the Hollywood moguls, or I don't know, W.C. Fields or somebody said, sincerity, once you learn to fake it, you got it made. Anyway, so John Brown had that gift. So John Brown said that the sins of this evil country will not be purged except by blood. So, and then came the Civil War, and slavery ended following this war in which 650, 700,000 people died. It looked as though John Brown was a prophet. He had prophesied this war, except I don't know if it counts as a prophecy, or maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you predict a war and then you start the war yourself. I don't know, if that makes you a seer or an instigator, but in any event, that's what happened. And even Abraham Lincoln, who began the war thinking, and certainly before the war, he thought that slavery could be ended without a great war. He hoped the Union could be saved without a great war. But by the end of the war, with his second inaugural address in 1865, in March of 1865, Lincoln came very close to saying that the war had been God's will. Now, as you look at Lincoln through the course of the war, he becomes more religious. And it's almost as though Lincoln is struggling with the weight of all of the death, all of the destruction. Lincoln knows perfectly well he was the one who insisted that that happened. Rarely do even presidents of the United States have history in their hands the way that Lincoln did. But if Lincoln, in response to Southern secession, had said, I think you're wrong, but it's not worth a war. Go in peace and we can get together later, there wouldn't have been a civil war. There wasn't sufficient grassroots insistence that we go to war. And Lincoln was the one who made the decision that led to the war. But by the end of the war, it's almost as though Lincoln's soul could not sustain by itself the responsibility for all of the death. And so in his second inaugural address, he says that if it is God's will that every drop of blood drawn by the slaver's lash must be repaid with a drop of blood drawn by the sword, then God's will be done. So he's basically buying into the John Brown prediction of blood atonement for slavery. And if you do accept that a civil war was necessary to end slavery, to end this blight on America, then you're willing to say, okay, John Brown, you're kind of like John the Baptist, you got there first. But I don't think that's a necessary conclusion. Now I can't prove that a civil war was unnecessary, but I will just put out something for listeners, viewers, consideration. And that is, in 1800, slavery was legal in essentially every country on earth. Not legal in the entire United States, but still legal under the US Constitution. It was legal almost everywhere else. And very few people in the world thought much about it. Again, it just fell in this, okay, it's just an unfortunate aspect of life. That's 1800. In 1900, nobody on earth considered slavery to be right. In fact, in almost no countries on earth was slavery legal. Between 1800 and 1900, there was this massive change of opinion regarding slavery. But it was only in the United States of America that a massive war, I'm not going to say was required, but a massive war was involved in the ending of slavery. Even Brazil, which was backward in politics and which slavery as a system was much more brutal than in the United States, even Brazil freed its slaves peacefully. So if other countries could figure out how to do it, presumably Americans could have figured it out. Maybe, if not for John Brown, if Southerners hadn't been quite so spooked, but it's a really hard question to answer. I certainly can't prove it. And you were just left with, I don't know. But again, so if you did want to say, did John Brown, instead of saying, did John Brown do the right thing? If I'd said, is John Brown a good model for people today? My students, they're looking for models. How shall I organize my life? Who shall I look up to? Who shall I pattern myself after? I would say, be very careful if you're going to try to model yourself after somebody like John Brown. Because what John Brown did was to declare himself above the laws. He declared himself the arbiter of whether this person should live and that person should live. And we can't see the future. So we don't know what's coming ahead. But as soon as you start down that path of saying, God tells me I need to do something, or this is so wrong that laws don't apply to me, then you're just right on the edge of ruin. And in a country of laws, in a democracy, you just can't operate under those premises. A much better model is Abraham Lincoln, who was, there's the irony here that John Brown tried to start the war and failed. Abraham Lincoln tried to avoid the war, failed too. And so Lincoln, who wanted to do this without war, was the president who presided over the worst war in American history. However, for Lincoln, the war was a last resort. He didn't go in there ahead of time. But it's just a reminder that history is complicated, and the lessons that it teaches us, they're complicated too.
It's really a fascinating observation, Bill, when you state that the United States was the only large country that had to fight a terrible war at its own expense, where it consumed itself to get rid of slavery, the institution of slavery in the modern era. That's a fascinating thesis. We're running out of time. A couple of our viewers want to know, because everybody I'm sure is very eager to have you back to West Michigan, hopefully next year when we bring you back, and hopefully it'll be April when the weather in West Michigan is nice. We'll want to know what next book you're going to be talking about. Give us a hint.
Okay,
it's going to be a parallel life.
Yes, it is. It's going to be in that parallel life sort of category. And so here is the hint. I said that and you said together, we said that the motivating question behind this book was, what does the good person do in the face of evil? Okay. The motivating question for the book that I'm actually finished, is coming out in November. The motivating question is, what causes a man to forsake his country and take arms against it? Should I give more than a hint? Oh, what the heck? I'll give more than a hint.
Yes, give us more.
The title of the book is, well, in fact, having just written this book about the Civil War, the title of this new book is Our First Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution. And again, it's this moral issue. So what causes, to take an example, what causes Benjamin Franklin to become a rebel, to forsake his country, Britain, and take arms against it, while his son, William Franklin, remained loyal? And if the slavery question was complicated, boy, the question of loyalty during the American Revolutionary War is even more complicated. In this case, I choose 7 and a half or 8 people. And I look at, half of them are patriots, that is the rebels, the ones who want independence, and half of them are loyalists, and what they go through to get to where they arrive at. And it's a reminder that the American Revolution was not this neat and clean thing where all the good people were on one side, and not even where all the Americans were on one side and the Brits were all on the other side. No, in fact, the point I make is that the American Revolution was indeed our first civil war. And for the Patriot side to win, to defeat the British, first they had to defeat their own fellow Americans, the Loyalists. So it was a messy business, but it's a broader cast. So it's I like it, but
Well, thank you so much. We can't wait. And thank you for all the energy and insight you brought to us. And I would say the wisdom, because you're counseling students, they're in need of civic models and wisdom, and your books and your teaching provide that. Bill, you're an inspiration year in and year out. We can't wait to have you back. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pitch it back to Jacob.
Thank you, Bill and Gleaves, for that fascinating discussion on Lincoln and Brown's competing visions for our nation's future. After this meeting ends, a link will pop open with a survey for this evening's event. I encourage you to fill that out, and please let us know what you thought of the event and give us feedback and suggestions for future events as well. Remember to join us on Thursday, May 13th at 7 p.m. when another fan favorite of the Hauenstein Center, author and historian Ronald C. White, joins us to discuss his forthcoming book, Lincoln in Private: What His Most Personal Reflections Tell Us About Our Greatest President. During his visit, Ron will give us a glimpse into the mind of our nation's greatest president by examining 12 of his most personal notes. You can register on our website at www.gvsu.edu/hc/events. Once again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a great night.